Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special interview. Now, everybody, you know when I bring out the championship belt signed by the Immortal Hulk Hogan, you know we're going to talk some wrestling. But before we talk some wrestling, let me introduce my man from Mississippi. Ladies and gentlemen, did I say gentlemen? Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Starton. Jeremy, tell everybody who you is.
I am from Mississippi, like Joseph said, and I am a promoter, independent wrestling promoter in Mississippi of Pro Wrestling Association.
Well, that's it. That's very humble of you. Anything else you've done?
I mean, I wrestled for a little while, you know, and just a fan and love the business and trying to pour back into it and make the best out of it we can, you know. So,
dude, you wrestled Kamala.
I did. I had some opportunities. I wrestled Kamala and Bill Dundee, some of the legends in the business, but so I had some opportunities there. But I try to stay humble about those. So
now, the last time we talked, we was on the line with Nikita Koloff. What have you been doing since then?
Just hanging out, working, staying busy, trying to get some shows running and doing some promoting here in Mississippi where I live. So.
All right, cool. Welcome back to the CTS. Ladies and gentlemen, if I had a list of accomplishments my next guest has done, it will take me forever to read them off. So we don't got a lot of time. I'm just going to go ahead and get to it. Ladies and gentlemen, on this edition of the special interview, it is the one and only Eric Bischoff. Eric, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, my friends. Doing very, very well.
So how's Cody Wyoming doing? How's it treating you?
Well, I love it here, man. I came out here the first time when I was 22 years old and fell in love with it then and promised myself someday I would live here. Built my house here in 1998 and have been loving it ever since.
Now, my first question to you is, now you're from Detroit, Michigan, but you have lived all over Detroit. I mean, you lived in Detroit, obviously. You lived in Atlanta, Stamford, Connecticut. You lived in a bunch of different places, a lot of busy places. What is the attraction of Cody, Wyoming?
It's not any of those other places. I've always, since I was a little kid, growing up in Detroit, I'm 65 years old. So I was born in the mid 50s. And by the time I was 7 or 8 years old in the early 60s, big thing on television at the time, back when there were only 4 channels, was Westerns, shows like Bonanza and the Virginian and Gunsmoke and so many of the other old classic Western TV shows. Well, I grew up on those things, and those shows were always kind of set in the mountains, and there were horses and elk and moose and deer. And I fell in love with that. And when I was about, 10 or 11, I guess, my dad actually made a trip out to Wyoming with a group of his friends to do some deer hunting. And as a little kid, the thought of my dad traveling all the way across the country and hunting deer out in the mountains, I was so excited for my dad. And when he came home, he told me the stories about Wyoming. And as I got older, I met a guy who was about 12 years older than I was when I was about 14 or 15. And we stayed friends, and as I got into my 20s, that friend of mine that I had become friends with as a young teen, he had come out to Cody, Wyoming to do some elk hunting. And when he came back, he told me how wonderful Wyoming was. So I made up my mind to come out and see it for myself. And when I was 22, and I did. It was the first time I'd ever been out west, first time I'd ever seen the mountains. And I just absolutely fell in love with it and just knew that this is where I wanted to live.
Now, we talked in the beginning about your list of accomplishments. You have had a lot of accomplishments in your life, and it's something you should be very, very proud of. I've always wondered about you. Do you consider yourself a wrestling promoter, a wrestling personality? When you look in the mirror, do you consider yourself a wrestling promoter, a personality, or just a businessman?
All of the above, as a wrestling executive, as a president of Turner Broadcast, as a president of WCW, which was Turner Broadcasting, I oversaw and was responsible for the promotion of WCW, the marketing of WCW, the business operations of WCW, and I was a talent. So, throughout my career, I've done a lot or a little bit of just about everything. And certainly promotion was one of the things that I did, but I don't look at myself as a wrestling promoter, probably more as a television executive in the wrestling business would probably be the best way to characterize it.
Now, when you first started out in professional wrestling, you was a ring announcer. You started in AWA, became a ring announcer in WCW, and you worked under a lot of legendary people, not only in the professional wrestling business, but in the business industry. When I say business industry, I mean people behind the scenes of Turner Broadcasting. Who was tough to work for? Vern Gagne, Jim Herd, Bill Shaw, Harvey Schiller, I hope I said his name right, or Vince McMahon. In your opinion, who was the hardest person to work for?
Vern wasn't hard to work for at all. I cherish the opportunity that I had to work with Vern for several years. I think Vern probably had the strongest impression on me that I still carry some of the, I guess, the lessons or the perspective that I learned about the wrestling industry from Vern and by working in proximity to Vern. I enjoyed, Vern and I became friends. He wasn't just my boss, he was a friend. So there was no point at all during my period with Vern that I ever considered it hard or difficult, or Vern being hard or difficult. I didn't work for Jim Herd long enough to get a real feel for Jim. Jim hired me, which I'm eternally grateful for. But I didn't work directly really with Jim Herd, so I can't really speak to what that was like for others who did. I did work for Bill Watts, and that was a pain in the ass. Didn't enjoy working for Bill Watts at all. Bill Shaw, once I was promoted to executive producer and I reported to Bill Shaw, who was the vice president of human resources at Turner Broadcasting. That again was much like Vern. I really, really liked Bill on a personal level, on a professional level. As my boss, he was more of a mentor in terms of helping me learn and adjust and adapt to a more formal corporate environment, which I had never experienced before. And Vern was really a mentor in that regard. Or excuse me, Bill Shaw was really a mentor in that regard. Vince McMahon, challenging, but fascinating at the same time. I wouldn't consider it hard. There were things about Vince McMahon, some peculiar personality traits, I guess, and ways that Vince liked to do business that made it challenging for me, but not to the point where it was uncomfortable or I didn't enjoy it. It was just different. So I other than Bill Watts, I am grateful for the opportunity that I've had to work with all of the people that I've worked with and learned from them and enjoyed it. Regardless of the challenge. Look, no job is easy, man. It doesn't matter what you do for a living. Elon Musk over at Tesla probably has bad days and difficult days and challenging days. The guy that picks up my garbage, every Tuesday morning probably has days that are exceptionally difficult and challenging. And every job that you may have in between is going to have times where they are challenging and difficult, but I don't think that's the same thing as unpleasant. It's just part of life.
You've obviously had a lot of time in the wrestling business and stuff. Who would you say the most talented wrestler you've ever worked with and had the opportunity to work with was?
Again, these are really good questions, but they're difficult ones to answer, probably because they are good, and they're good because they're complex. There's no single answer to that. First of all, a successful wrestler is, number one, it's in the eye of the beholder. What do you appreciate most about a certain performer? Growing up, in my early teens and even into my 20s, late 20s even, to me, Nick Bockwinkel was the consummate performer. His skills on the mic were second to no one to this day. I think Nick Bockwinkel probably delivered some of the most powerful and artful, believable interviews and promos, if you will, dialogue, whatever you want to call it. And he was exceptionally good in the ring, exceptionally. To this day, I don't think you'll find too many people that could really stand up to the psychology and the execution and the believability and the storytelling capabilities of a guy like Nick Bockwinkel. But you look at The Rock. Now, was Rock nearly as technically gifted as Nick Bockwinkel? No. In my opinion, were his promos as compelling? Not really. But they were more powerful. He reached a larger audience. A larger segment of the audience related to The Rock, and a lot of that has to do with, the timing and the state of the wrestling industry, the state of the television industry, and all that. But it's undeniable that Rock is one of the most successful performers in the history of the industry. Same could be true for Hulk Hogan during his era. Was he a gifted technical wrestler? Absolutely not. Did he have the ability to create emotion and connect with an audience probably better than anybody before him or since him? Yeah, he did. Yeah. Again, the time was different. The state of the industry was different. The state of television was different. The state of pop culture was different. So it's not really an apples to apples comparison. But I've had, John Cena is another guy who was an amazing performer, a work ethic second absolutely to no one, who captured the imagination of tens of millions of people around the world. Loved working with John. Chris Jericho, amazing talent to work with. Mick Foley, amazing talent to work with. Steve Austin, can't forget Steve Austin. He should be at the top of the list, right up there with Rock and Hogan, in my opinion. Ric Flair. I mean, they each have their own unique strengths. Yeah. And during their respective careers, each of them made an enormous contribution to the industry itself and elevated it in their own ways. But their own ways were all unique in some respects. So it's really hard to point out one person. Developed a lot of great friendships over the years. Hulk Hogan to this day is one of, if not my best friend in the industry. Diamond Dallas Page, a very close friend of mine. Ernest the Cat Miller, great friend of mine. Sonny Ono. There's so many people that Bruce Pritchard, who's now, Vince McMahon's right-hand man over at WWE. There's so many people that I've had the opportunity to work with that have become so much more than people I worked with. They've become very, very close friends and important people in my life. So it's really difficult to pick out one.
Yeah. Well, you definitely named some greats in there. Some of what a lot of people would consider some of the greatest of all time in the business, but like you said, from different eras and everything. So if we are talking about your time in WCW and there was one segment that you could be given the opportunity to rewrite and rebook that segment, what would it be and how would you rebook that?
Oh, we're getting precariously close to a hypothetical question, and I hate those. But every once in a while, I do a show over at adfreeshows.com where I let fans and family members who are part of the adfreeshows.com platform, I let them be the booker. I let them pick a match, or even in some cases a pay-per-view, and I'll let our members over at AdFree, I call them family. We let our family members over at adfreeshows.com rebook an event, and that's fun to do. It's a fun look back and a way to have fun with a hypothetical situation. But I think, if I think the finger poke of doom would be something I would revisit. There was a lot of things, even in 96 and 97, that I experimented with, that I would, if I had the privilege and the hindsight of 2020, I would probably rebook or eliminate altogether. Some of the silliness around the Dungeon of Doom, the Kevin Sullivan, family of misfits. I could have done without that. And there was others, the Yeti or Yeti. That was another, and that fell into the finger poke of doom kind of Dungeon of Doom category. But, here's the thing about, when you're in a creative business, you try things and you experiment with things that maybe weren't necessarily my cup of tea, not something that I really was fond of. But, when you're producing for the masses, in my case, I was producing a television show that in the mid 90s that was being watched by 4, 5, 6, 7 million people in prime time. And when you're in that position, you can't just produce the types of things that appeal to you as an individual. You have to produce the things that appeal to the masses, even if some of those things aren't necessarily on your menu of things that you like. So, you try things and some of them work unexpectedly. Some of them fail, maybe expectedly, but you try them anyway, because you don't know. You don't know until you try. And that's part of the process of growing and learning your audience and understand and taking the audience's temperature every single week on live television. You try certain things, and sometimes they work well. Sometimes they work amazingly. Sometimes they make history, like the NWO. Sometimes you do things that completely change the entire industry as it existed, like the cruiserweight division. And then sometimes you try things like the finger poke and doom, which come back and bite you in the ass for decades.
Well, I'm going to say this. This is not a question. This is more of my opinion. And I want to apologize for the hypotheticals, but because of your number one podcast, 83 Weeks, which I suggest everybody check out, you pretty much answer every single question that every wrestling fan has ever wanted to know. So when we got these questions, we wanted to ask questions that probably nobody has ever heard. You probably never heard, and you probably have heard them, and we just didn't know. But with that said, you talk about Hulk Hogan not being a very technical wrestler. Ladies and gentlemen, you can go to Japan right now. You can go to New Japan Pro Wrestling app right now for how much money it is, and you can watch a very technical Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan is probably one of the best professional wrestlers ever in the history, inside the ring and outside the ring. And that's not really an opinion, that's a fact. If you don't believe me, go to the Japan tapes. I'm more of a person that watches professional wrestling for what is portrayed to be, not for what it actually is. I get psyched up for a big fight. If you pump up a good fight, just take Money in the Bank 2011, CM Punk, John Cena. Vince McMahon had my money. Let's talk about Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock. I didn't even watch UFC at the time. They had my money. So if you pump a good fight, you're gonna get my money. So with that said, Hulk Hogan, he knew how to wrestle. And he just in America he didn't have to. As for the Dungeon of Doom comment, today's fans who wasn't alive like to excuse my shit on that angle, but it was very compelling. You had Lex Luger. Was he going to turn on the Macho Man Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan? What was Luger going to do? Savage and Hogan didn't trust him, but Sting did. It was a lot of compelling storylines that was inside just that Dungeon of Doom story. That story. I don't want to talk like professional wrestlers, but I mean, you listen to a lot of stuff and you pick up the language. So it was a lot of comparing stories inside just that Dungeon of Doom angle, and I really enjoyed it. But with that said, I brought up Les Luger. Relationships in professional wrestling. You got some good ones and you got some bad ones, and you've talked about them publicly. Jesse Ventura, Bret the Hitman Hart, and let's take Bret Hart for example. He's made up with Shawn Michaels. He's made up with Vince McMahon. For you, he doesn't. He bashes you every chance he gets. Vince Russo, So let's take Jesse Ventura, Bret Hart, Vince Russo. You have personally made up with Les Luger on a podcast you did years ago. You had a very long, extended interview with him. It was very touching. So with Jesse Ventura, Vince Russo, Bret Hart, hypothetical question. If Vince Russo ever says, hey, listen, what I did at WCW, what I wrote at WCW, and admits to it right now and says, hey, listen, I did not do a good job. Is there a chance in maybe hypothetically, I know you hate it, but Jesse Ventura, Bret Hart, Vince Russo, Honky Tonk Man, is it a chance that maybe one day y'all can just bury the hatchet?
With the exception of Vince Russo, I have a lot of respect for Bret Hart in a lot of ways. I have some issues with some of the things he says, not just about me, but, I think Bret Hart, as I've said before, it's no secret, Bret Hart is a miserable person and a very unhappy person. I guess they're one and the same. And for whatever reason, burying people or having someone to blame for whatever it is Bret Hart feels he needs to blame someone for is about the only way that Bret can have a conversation. I don't like being around people like that. I was with Bret. I sat down at a table with Ric Flair and Bret Hart and half a dozen other guys about a year and a half, 2 years ago in the UK. I wasn't sitting there just with Bret. I mean, Bret was a part of the group, and we sat there and had beers and had fun. And, Bret and I didn't exchange a lot of, there wasn't a lot of conversation between Bret and I, but we're able to sit down and we were able to sit down and socialize. And from my perspective, still can. I've got no issue with Bret. I will respond to Bret when he feels the need to lash out. I will point out the inconsistencies in a lot of the things that I hear Bret say. I will point out what I consider to be a real weakness in his character and personality. But that doesn't mean that I don't respect him. And I could certainly sit down and have a beer with Bret and not let anything that's been said or printed get in the way of, enjoying his company. It is what it is. I feel the same way about Jesse Ventura. The heat, I guess, if you want to call it that I had with Jesse goes back to something that happened back in 94, 95. And Jesse felt very strongly. He was very anti-Hulk Hogan. I was bringing Hulk Hogan in. We were using Hulk Hogan to elevate the company. Jesse had an issue with that. He couldn't keep himself. And I ended up having to fire him. Not just for that, but for other things. But that doesn't mean I don't respect Jesse Ventura. And it doesn't mean I wouldn't want to sit down and have a beer with Jesse. Doesn't mean I couldn't have a good time hanging out with Jesse. Vince Russo's another story. He's a liar. He's a manipulator. He's a con artist. And he's, I think, delusional, if not pathological, in with respect to the truth and reality. There will never be an opportunity. There will never be a moment that I will willingly share oxygen with Vince Russo in a room, much less a beer or a meal. But that's because Vince, in my opinion, is because he is pathological and delusional. He's about the only one that I can think of. Honky Tonk Man, I don't care, man. He can say whatever he wants to say. I've got really thick skin. It's pretty hard. Unless you lie to me or try to steal from me or my family, I don't really carry a grudge. But once you lie to me or you try to take advantage of me or therefore my family financially, your name goes onto a list that it will never come off of. Just like it would if you were to break into my house and steal something from my safe. To me, there's a point where certain people are only there to take from you or to take from a situation that they can exploit that you are a part of. And those people, like I said, they go on a list that they never come off of. And Vince Russo's at the top of that list, but none of the others that you mentioned are.
Even the Honky Tonk Man?
Even the Honky Tonk Man.
I hear you. Listen, we talked about the Dungeon of Doom. I heard you say that, when you became senior vice president of WCW, you wanted to make World Championship Wrestling more adult oriented. because WWE, WWF at the time, now WWE, was cartoonish. I mean, they had, a garbage man. I mean, I'm not saying nothing bad about Duke the Dumpster Drosy. I'm sure he's a nice guy. But Diesel and all this stuff. I like Diesel, by the way. But you talked about the Dungeon of Doom. WCW was a little cartoonish too. How did you get out from the cartoonish ways of WCW? Because I mean, Hulk Hogan going into a dungeon and fighting the Giant was a little cartoonish. I mean, would you agree to that?
Well, the transition from an 80s style of wrestling, which was basically doing the same thing WWF was doing at the time, a very cartoonish, animated, it was like a live action comic book is what it was. It wasn't like I made the change overnight. It was a gradual change or evolution from that cartoonish presentation or childlike presentation to a more reality-based, adult-themed presentation. And that took place, that started really in about 90, late 95, early 96. It became the reality-based or more adult-themed presentation within Nitro and WCW started really happening in 96 and 97. But going back to what I said earlier, when you're programming for the masses, not everybody was into the reality-based and adult-themed based, more mature-based storytelling. Some people still liked the very cartoonish aspects of professional wrestling. It's a little bit like
I was one of them. I love.
I won't interrupt you if you don't interrupt me. It's my only pet peeve.
Go ahead.
So when I did make the transition into more reality-based television, we still had elements of the more animated, cartoonish things that you refer to, because it's like opening a restaurant. You decide you're going to have a buffet. If you're going to have a buffet and you want to be the best buffet in town, you're going to have a great salad. You're going to have great chicken. You're going to have great steak. You're going to have great pasta. You're going to have, pork chops. You're going to have all kinds of things. You're not just going to have chicken. You've got to be able to appeal to the masses. So we skewed more reality-based. We presented more reality-based, but we still maintained a little bit of the more animated presentation. Okay, I'm done. Thinking about that ridiculous belt hanging over your shoulder, but
hey, whoa! This is signed by the Immortal Hulk Hogan. This is not ridiculous. Matter of fact, the Hulkamania is getting kind of heavy. So, with that said, I got to put it down.
I just got to bust your balls. I haven't made fun of your sunglasses yet, so. But we're early.
You still got time. You still got time. What I was trying to say is, I enjoyed it. Like I told you before, Les Luger thing happening, it was very entertaining, trying to figure out, is he going to be a good guy, bad guy? Is he going to be with Hogan and Macho Man? So it was a good, I hate using wrestling terms, but because I'm a fan, storyline.
Well, storyline isn't a wrestling. Storyline isn't a wrestling term. Storyline is a general term that you can apply to movies, books, television commercials, wrestling.
But when you watch it, fans today still, like, to me, I still watch it as a sport, just because while I watch it, it's like watching a movie. That's one of the biggest problems I got with Vince Russo. Every time you listen to him in an interview and you criticize something he did in professional wrestling, he'll go, "Bro, it's fake. It's fake, bro." I'm like, well, so is the movie, but it's got to make sense. So when I'm watching professional wrestling, I try to keep the whole, I don't need somebody to come in here and come out who's a good worker and this and that. If you're that type of fan, that's not me. I'm into the hype. I'm into the fight. But with that said, when they talk about history of Ted Turner, history of television, the 90s wrestling is never mentioned. Why do you think? Why do you think that is? What do you think about that?
I think professional wrestling as a genre within the entertainment industry as a whole is still kind of looked at as an odd duck. You know, it's not drama, but it is. It's not comedy. It's not a sitcom, but it is. It's not really a sport in a traditional sense, but it is. It's not really a documentary, but occasionally it is. So because wrestling is such a unique genre that appeals to a very specific audience, and although the audience is becoming broader and broader, you know, every day, but the television industry as a whole and the people that write about the industry in general tend to dismiss professional wrestling and its significance in pop culture and in television history, which is really a shame, because if you know anything about the television industry and the history of it in professional wrestling, you would know that professional wrestling was one of the very first successful network television programs in the history of television. You would know, for example, that before cable came along, professional wrestling as a syndicated product was probably was the most watched show in any major television market in the country on Saturdays or Sundays. When cable television came along, professional wrestling became, and still is, one of the most successful television properties and genres in the history of cable television. When pay-per-view was born out of cable television, professional wrestling became, and in some arguably still is, one of the more successful genres in the world of pay-per-view. Now we're in the digital world, right? Everything's digital, streaming and internet. Professional wrestling, and WWE in particular, is one of the leading digital platforms in the world. So since the beginning of television time, as many times as television has changed and evolved, and the platforms have evolved, professional wrestling has always been at the forefront. But for whatever reason, people don't like to read about it, and partially because it's a mystery to them. They don't understand it. They don't understand why people watch it. They don't understand how it could become so successful. They don't understand the work and the commitment that went into it. So since they don't know anything about it and don't want to take the time to learn about it, it's easier just to skip over it.
Eric, you mentioned earlier that about the NWO, and I think, in my personal opinion, I've been a wrestling fan my whole life. I think that's one of the greatest groups ever built, you know, and that goes credit to you. You know, you had the opportunity to build that, and I know many people think that's, you know, one of the greatest factions ever be built. If you could rebuild the NWO today, not using any previous members, who would you choose to rebuild that with?
It's a fair question and a good question, but it's too hard for me to answer. You know, part of that is because I don't really watch enough of the current product to have an intimate feel for some of the characters that are emerging and are becoming stars. The industry has changed a lot. The appetite, the audience, and their expectations have evolved and changed a lot. So unless I was really in it, like up to my earlobes in it, it would be really hard for me to come up with anything that was realistic. So I'm going to take a respectful pass on that one.
Yeah, that's fair. I can see that, where that would be a difficult question to ask if you don't really watch a lot of the current product anymore.
Let me dig into that just a little bit, though. You know, one of the reasons that the NWO worked wasn't just because it was Hulk Hogan and Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. It was what those characters represented, what their point of view was. You know, as a whole, the NWO concept was, at its core, kind of based in the idea of anarchy, meaning a group of guys who, in the case of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, the premise of that storyline before it was even named the NWO was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash had both previously worked for WCW. They weren't happy with the push they got or the opportunities that they got or the money that they were making. So they left WCW to go on to WWF, where they became big stars. And then once they became big stars, they wanted to come back to WCW and take revenge on the people in WCW who didn't give them the opportunities that they felt they deserved. It's kind of no different than if you were a kid in junior high that got beat up every day by the junior high school bully. And then you went off and you learned martial arts and you hit the weights and you trained. And then you came back in the 11th grade and beat the shit out of that kid that used to torment you in junior high. It's kind of the same psychology. That's what that group represented. Now, they did a great job. First of all, it was a believable storyline because much of the fiction that went into the NWO storyline was based in elements of reality. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash did work for WCW. They did go on to WWF and become big stars. The fiction, the storyline, if you will, was them coming back to WCW to take revenge. That's the fiction that we manufactured, but it was believable. And Scott and Kevin did a great job representing those characters and that story and that emotion. Hulk Hogan turning heel because he didn't feel the fans gave him the respect he deserved, in many respects, was something that was also born out of reality. Because if you remember, before Hulk Hogan turned heel, the audience was kind of getting a little tired of the red and yellow thing, and they weren't really buying the eat your vitamins and say your prayers and train every day. That character was no longer resonating with the audience, and they were rejecting it. So that gave believability to Hulk Hogan saying, "Screw you, I'm in this for me," and he turned heel. It wasn't just that he turned heel; it was he turned heel in a real and believable way. People they may not have liked it, but they certainly related to it and understood it to be true. And it was that believability in the reality within the NWO story that made it work. We're talking about a quarter of a century ago. And the NWO is still one of the hottest merchandise items in the WWE merchandise catalog. But it wasn't just because it was Scott Hall and Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan. It was because it was Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Hulk Hogan in a believable, compelling story.
Yeah. And I think that's what made it such a dynamic turning point in professional wrestling, if you will, because it was so believable. It was so real life.
And again, if going back to your question, and I'm sorry I interrupted you. That was rude.
No, you're good.
I apologize.
No, you're good.
But if we were going to try to recreate an NWO today, if I was charged with that mission, can you hear my duck? My phone has I use a mallard duck quack as my alert on my phone. So if you hear ducks, now you know why. But if you were going to recreate an NWO, you would have to look for characters that had kind of a believable backstory that would support the premise of your storyline. Is there a talent out there? John Moxley. If I was going to create the NWO for WWE, for example, I might make a move, not that it's possible and not that I would be successful, but if I was going to try to recreate an NWO in WWE, I'd be picking up the phone and trying to have a conversation with CM Punk. I'd be having a conversation with John Moxley. I'd be having, conversations with people who had a chip on their shoulder about the way they were treated in the WWE, so that when they came back to try to make things right and get revenge, it had a believable premise that people go, "Oh, I know this is wrestling, but yeah, I know that part's true." Yeah. And blurring the story, blurring fiction and reality is the magic that makes wrestling work.
Yeah, you've got to make that moment where a fan forgets what they think they know about wrestling and make them believe it's real. And so yeah, I definitely good response there. I like that. Moxley and Punk would be definitely interesting in that. So I like your take on that. I guess my last question for you, Eric, would be if you were booking and you had the opportunity to book a match between Jim Cornette and Vince Russo, what kind of match would it be? And we know who would win, but what kind of match would you book it to be?
Well, who would win?
I mean, I think Cornette. I think you'd pick Cornette to win, probably. So
Why would you pick Cornette to win? Well, Cornette's not a fighter. Cornette's a talker.
well,
Cornette's convinced everybody he's a fighter, but he's a punk. He's a soft, flabby, mouthy punk. And I think Vince Russo is probably not far from that, although Vince doesn't try to pretend he's a tough guy. Vince doesn't threaten people. Vince doesn't threaten to show up on your doorstep with a baseball bat. But that's projecting something. That's Cornette projecting something that's, number one, it exposes a real weakness, because anybody that was a real badass, first of all, they wouldn't need a baseball bat, number one. And number two, they're not gonna talk about it. They're just gonna do it. They're not gonna threaten you. They're just gonna do it. So I learned this growing up as a kid in Detroit, where I got into a fight 3 times a day. I got beat up on my way to school. I got beat up for my lunch money, and I got beat up on my way home from school 3 times a day, 5 days a week for about 14 years. So I know all about real badasses and pretend badasses. And the fake badasses are the people that try to convince you that they're badasses. The real ones just not you. I'd like to see Russo and Cornette in a 60-minute last man standing match, because they would both blow up after about 45 seconds, and they would expose themselves for being the pieces of garbage that they both really are.
that was the response I was hoping to get from you when I asked that question. I that's why I asked that, kind of going off. I figured that you would have a good response to that. So
Eric is not short for words. All right. So Eric, Mr. Bischoff, I'm gonna tell you something, man. You're raw. You don't give a f.
Well, of course I do in some respects, but look, I'm just giving you my honest opinion. and honestly, at this stage of my life, the inventory of to give is pretty limited. So yeah, there's some things I do care about, there's things I'm concerned about, but the opinions of people like Jim Cornette and Vince Russo are not on that list.
And you should never interrupt somebody when they're talking, Mr. Bischoff. A very wise businessman told me that one time. It seemed like just a couple of minutes ago, he taught me that lesson. With that said, you always, how you being a businessman, and I do consider you a very successful businessman. I mean, you had a production company with Jason Hervey. I apologize. You was executive producer of hit shows like 45 and Single and other reality TV shows that I enjoyed. A legendary businessman like Ted Turner, how do you think he was able to lose his company the way he did? I mean, Ted Turner, when you think business, you think Ted Turner, you think Trump, you think these are the icons of business. How did you think Ted Turner just let that happen, in your opinion?
Well, like all of us, I was on the outside looking in. I don't know what the internal decisions or discussions or thoughts were of Ted Turner. I think as a general rule, or not a general rule, as a general observation, I think it's safe to say that, if you read any books about Ted or you read his biography, autobiographies, doesn't matter, you'll consistently come across periods of time when Ted's goal, his vision, was to own a network. Although Ted, created in many respects, he didn't create cable television, but he certainly built cable television along with a couple other people that could be credited for that. But Ted's real goal, in addition to establishing a worldwide 24-hour news platform and growing the cable industry, was also to own a network. And he tried. He tried a couple times throughout his career. He tried to acquire CBS. He wanted to acquire NBC. And he wasn't able to do that. And I think what Ted may have seen towards the end of his professional life was an opportunity with Time Warner and ultimately AOL to do something as big as a network acquisition, just different. And I think perhaps, I don't know this to be true. This is just, seeing how things happened from a distance. But I think his ambition and his vision to acquire something as big as a network probably got the better of him, and he got compromised. He allowed himself to be compromised. He lost control. And it happens sometimes. It's no different, I guess, than, I'll try to give you an example. If you owned a small taco shop and there was a bigger restaurant down the street that said, hey, we really love your tacos. Why don't you kind of move your business into our business and you'll have more customers and you'll sell more tacos? Well, that's true. If you merge your small little family-owned taco shop with a big Mexican chain, you'll probably sell more tacos, but you won't be in charge anymore. You'll have to give up control. You'll have to make compromises. And I think that's kind of what Ted did in his own way, is while he had complete control of Turner Broadcasting, his vision, his direction, his management. But once he merged with something bigger than him and bigger than Turner Broadcasting, he compromised some of that control. And I think that's really what happened to Ted Turner. And it's a trade-off. When you want to merge your company with somebody else's company, all of a sudden somebody else's management is going to have a lot to say about how you conduct your business. It's just a fact of life.
Now, somebody as a layman in business like myself, I listened to you on your hit podcast, 83 Weeks with Comrade Thompson. You talk about how you tried to purchase WCW. And one of the things that was the killer was y'all didn't have a network. Turner Network was going to pull out and the deal was done. My question is, and I always wanted to know this, and I guess I never heard the answer, but wasn't there other networks? I mean, Vince McMahon bought WCW for $6 million. You had so many other networks. Y'all couldn't pitch WCW to other networks?
It was possible, but difficult. And it was not so much that it was impossible to pitch another network, but what made it incredibly difficult and basically what made us choose not to try to find a network was because of the timing. We would have had to acquire WCW for a significant amount of money. It would have been more than $6 million at the time. And we would have had to make that major investment and hope that we were going to find another outlet. That's a big risk. And at the time, there wasn't a big appetite on other networks for professional wrestling. It just wasn't. So while I understand how people who weren't really in the industry, in the television industry, would go, well, why didn't you just go somewhere else? That's a plausible question or a good question. But it wasn't practical at the time because of timing, risk, investment, and the fact that there just wasn't really an appetite for professional wrestling amongst a lot of other cable outlets.
Well, my last question is pretty simple. You got a lot of relationships in the professional wrestling business. You say your best friend is one of probably the number one, my favorite wrestler of all time, Hulk Hogan. DDP, you said that is a good friend of yours. My question is, it's real simple. How hard is it in this line of work in the professional wrestling business to keep friends, to have long lasting friends like a Hulk Hogan, a Diamond Dallas Page, maybe Sting, people that you work with for 20 years? How hard is it to keep these relationships?
It's not hard at all. It's no different than any other job or anything else that you're involved in. You meet people that you work with, you meet people that you go to church with, you meet people that you play softball with. Some of them you like because you have some things in common and you're chemistry and your perspectives on life kind of click, and you gravitate towards them, and they become lifelong friends. You know, wrestling is no different, really, in my opinion, than a lot of any other business. It has some unique challenges, obviously, but in terms of developing and maintaining friendships, I don't think it's any different than anything else.
Oh, without said, hey, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say this. This has been probably one of the complete. This is probably, honestly, I've interviewed so many people that I looked up to, but this is one of those moments where I truly am humbled. Jeremy, any last words for Mr. Bischoff?
And I just thank you for your time and just to be able to pick the brain of what I believe one of the best promoters to be, and one of the best minds in the game, you know, in the wrestling business, and just opportunity to pick your mind and just to chat with you. I appreciate you taking the time with us today.
Well, I appreciate this opportunity. Look, I love, you know, doing podcasts like this with guys who are like you, that are up and coming, and you're trying to, you know, to get established in the podcast world, and you're passionate about professional wrestling. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with both you guys. I hope you nothing but the best of luck in the future, and, you know, keep plugging away, man. Professional wrestling, independent wrestling is at its core the lifeblood of the industry. And it's guys like you that are out there, you know, promoting small shows or big shows at the local level that keep it interesting and provide an alternative. So thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you guys. And down the road, you want to do it again, you know how to get a hold of me.
Well, with that said, I want you to go ahead and tell you, just like I tell every guest, you're part of the CTS family. You're always welcome back. Honestly, I humbly really do mean this. It's been truly an honor. It's been a privilege. Ladies and gentlemen, not only legendary businessman, but legendary wrestling personality, Eric Bischoff. Jeremy, Eric, stay on the line. Everybody else, see you next time.